Hi everyone, this is Mr. Volkowski. Today we're going to leave off from the notes today concerning the declaration of war that the United States is going to make against Japan following Pearl Harbor and subsequently Germany and Italy as part of the Tripartite Pact declaring war on the United States as part of their mutual alliance. What we're going to see as a result of World War II, in the beginning of it, specifically in 1941, is this term known as total war, where the United States and all of society was literally engrossed in the war effort in one way or another. Wherever you went, you were bombarded with images, whether in posters, whether you went to the movies and seeing advertisements, you would literally know that you were in a state of war. And if you contrast that to today, the United States is definitely still at war, and you may not even notice it on a daily basis or even a weekly basis unless you routinely watch the news. By no means is the United States in total war today. But nevertheless, propaganda is going to become a major tool for the United States, something that people at the home front or in the home front are going to be subject to with a variety of different posters, propaganda posters, if you will. So, for example, United We Will, you see people working in the war effort. Some of these are quite ominous and scary, for example, in terms of trying to conserve resources. As this poster shows, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. And of course, you see this image of Hitler riding in the empty seat. So you should carpool with your fellow workers, or if you're not conserving materials for the war effort, certainly this waste is going to help the enemy, as this makeshift outline of Hitler, an interesting paintbrush serving as Hitler's mustache, is certainly going to hopefully scare you into conservation, as the Office of War Information, or the OWI, would certainly hope. And in many ways, this was similar to the Committee on Public Information during World War I, if you remember that, in terms of sort of coordinating what type of information went out there. And you had similar types of propaganda, if you remember that Mad Brute poster with that beast coming across on the shores of the United States, certainly to similarly here invoke that scary theme that if you don't help in the war effort, that certainly it will result in your demise. And again, just going along with that theme of that ominous nature of this German soldier watching you, certainly you see these images here. And certainly you see other images of this in terms of it being directed towards Japan, also the theme of sacrifice. So certainly with respect to total war, all members of society are going to be actively engaged in the war effort. It was almost impossible not to, which is very much needed from the United States' perspective to win the war. So in terms of expanding the military for total war, well, you'll certainly see this in significant numbers. For example, you have over 10 million drafted, another 5 million are going to volunteer for World War II. And this was even seen prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor under Roosevelt with the Selective Service Act, when Roosevelt pushed Congress to enact a law for compulsory military service, which required all men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register for the draft, as well as the training of 1.2 million troops in just under 1 year. So certainly that's going to become important and vital for the draft, and again, in this notion of expanding the military for total war. Equally as important were the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, which by its end had over 260,000 members. These women were particularly important in terms of repairing machines, decoding enemy communication, and essentially freeing up men to be able to fight, as this title of auxiliary alludes to. Now, in terms of the changing the workforce for total war, as men are going to volunteer for the war as well as be drafted in, again, about 15 million, you have a number of defense jobs that are left open by men, and women are going to be the unsung heroes in terms of filling these needed defense jobs to support the war efforts. Almost 5 million women are going to enter the workforce, many of them in these industrial work capacities, whether it's in shipyards or defense plants. And the famous Rosie the Riveter poster is going to come out. It was actually a song which was used to encourage women to take these defense jobs. Interestingly enough, although people such as Eleanor Roosevelt are going to fight for women's equal pay, women typically only received two-thirds of what a male would make for these jobs. But nevertheless, women were vital to sustaining the war effort. In addition, you're going to have the War Production Board come about, being established by FDR. And one thing that it does is it takes over factories and it retools them for war production. So instead of mass producing consumer goods, they are now being retooled to help support the war production. Also important in terms of organizing recycling. So in many ways, you can feel the effects of total war, whether you're working, whether you've been drafted, many different areas in which you are being bombarded with propaganda as well. So every day, it would almost be impossible not to notice that the United States is involved in World War II because it just dominated society at home. Now, one last part concerning total war was the Office of Scientific Research and Development, otherwise known as the OSRD, in which scientists were organized to innovate for the war. This led to new developments in electronics, from radar to sonar, along with medicines, including penicillin. You also had the advent of jet engines, rockets, and of course the secret Manhattan Project, aka the atomic bomb, that's going to be pioneered by the OSRD. Interestingly enough, many of the scientists who worked in the OSRD had escaped from the fascist parts of Europe, and many had helped to later contribute to their defeat in Europe by working with the United States. Another big part of total war was in reference to taxing and rationing. One important agency was the Office of Price Administration, in which there were price and wage controls, and it also rationed key food items, again, to sustain the war efforts. So, for example, there were stamps given to every American family for goods ranging from sugar, coffee, gasoline, and this was to ensure that they were not being used in abundance, so a family would receive a certain number of stamps that they could use each week, and that would help to reduce the amount of those items used and thus sustain them and save them for troops and for the war effort overseas. So as a result of rationing many goods, you see the lack of consumer goods for sale, which actually allows American families to save a lot of the money that they would have normally spent on consumer goods and put that into savings, one thing that's going to be very important in terms of expanding the economy following World War II. Now, of course, when anything is limited, you have the rise of black markets, and certainly this was true during World War II, and things such as meat or gasoline you could buy at very high prices. However, certainly with the United States government focused on a propaganda effort, you had posters such as these made by people saying, "Make this pledge, I pay no more than top legal prices." And this sort of got cut off, but it says, "I accept no ration goods without giving up ration stamps." So that was one way to try to counteract the black markets that do develop, but that was sort of almost impossible to eliminate. Now, with respect to taxing, the Revenue Act of 1942 is going to come about, and this is the first time where you have not just the upper echelon of society being taxed, but also lower and middle income Americans who are paying federal income taxes is actually being taken out of their checks for the first time. And not to mention, if you look at the top personal income tax, it was at 88%, so you would only actually be able to keep 12% of your income. So if you made more than $200,000. So certainly you could notice the high amount of taxes that were going to be used to sustain the war effort. And of course, you had the use of war bonds as well, which were very instrumental, especially during World War I. Certainly World War II, that will be true as well. So just to recap some of the main points here, with total war, you felt it everywhere, whether you were working in a factory, whether you had a loved one serving overseas, whether you were purchasing war bonds, whether you were getting your check from work, you saw the tax coming about from that, and of course propaganda posters. So with total war, all of society is sustained in the war effort. And that will be all for this evening.